Begin with a map spread across a table, corners weighted by enamel mugs gone cold, a pencil tracing an arc across a continent that has forgotten how to sleep. The year is 1939, then 1940, then all the pages that follow. Factories learn to speak in rivets. Seas hum with propellers. Radios hiss with voices that don't know yet that they are history. And quietly, almost shyly at first, new ideas begin to take command, wiring themselves into tactics, changing how generals think, how sergeants move, how ordinary people live or live longer. This is the story of innovations that didn't just win fights. They rewired the fights themselves. Start where the sky meets the coast. In the spring and summer of 1940, a thin line of awkward towers rises along the British shoreline. They look like a child drew skyscrapers wrong. Inside them, waves of radio energy sweep the air like invisible searchlights. Radar is not a weapon with teeth. It is a clock with eyesight. On paper, it is called a chain home because each station links to the next, passing sightings like buckets in a fire brigade. A contact appears as a ghost on a cathode screen. A young woman at a plotting table moves a marker. A controller in a headset directs a squadron. The doubting system, radar, observers, telephones, fighter control, turns air defense from guesswork into choreography. Before radar, air strategy is a storm. Send many, hope much, pray you find something. After radar, air strategy is a dance. Launch late, climb once, strike where you must. Fewer planes in the air at any minute. More planes where they matter in the 1 minute that counts. Fighter command conserves pilots and fuel, meeting raids with just enough force, at just the right time, in just the right place. The innovation is not only the machine that sees, it is the network that believes what it sees quickly. A nation holds its breath, exhales smoke, and stays standing because information arrives in time to become action. Being shift the map inward into a mansion that smells like damp paper and hot valves. Typewriter keys tick like rain. Bletchley Park is not a battlefield, but it fights every hour. Here, the innovation is subtraction. Remove secrecy from the enemy by turning clever machines against cleverer math. The Enigma cipher is supposed to be a fortress with a new key every day. But add Polish breakthroughs, British engineering, and a stubborn army of minds, and the fortress develops doors. Bombs, those great humming cabinets, whirl through possibilities until a message becomes a sentence, and a sentence becomes a convoy route, and a convoy route becomes a place where U-boats aren't. Ultra, they call the intelligence born in those rooms, and it changes strategy as surely as any armored division. And a convoy system that once felt like herding sheep with blindfolds now herds with knowledge. Naval escorts arc not toward fear but toward facts. The Atlantic doesn't become safe, it never is, but it becomes survivable. Imagine the difference. A captain who used to zigzag forever now zigzags toward a plan. Weeks later, somewhere over desert or meadow, a tank column rolls 10 minutes ahead of an ambush because a decrypted signal mentioned fuel at a crossroads, and a nervous colonel made a choice that might have been luck once, but is certainty now. Intelligence stops being decoration at the end of a report and becomes the hinge of the plan itself. Turn the page, and the ground begins to move at an unfamiliar speed. Tanks used to be battering rams. Artillery used to be a prelude that never ended. Somebody stitches them together with the infantry and the radio, and the stitch holds even under fire. Blitzkrieg is not magic, it is marriage. Armor punches through, not to duel other armor, but to rip the seams of coherence. Dive bombers don't just destroy, they paralyze command posts and choke junctions. Infantry rides the wake of shock. And under all of it, a radio net keeps the tempo. Commanders, once trapped inside the speed of a courier, can now speak into the speed of a moment. The counter-innovation will become doctrine too. Anti-tank defenses in depth, mines in lines that feel like teeth under grass, Reserves withheld not from caution but to strike at flanks that sprint too fast. But in the first seasons, the lesson is plain. Strategy no longer means moving chess pieces slowly and hoping the knight arrives. It means turning minutes into weapons. And across the world, the ocean becomes a highway with no lanes and rules written by whoever owns the deck that day. In 1941 and 1942, battleships still wear the crown in the photographs. But carriers steal the throne in the ledger of consequences. A flat, odd-looking ship with a city's worth of gasoline below decks becomes the center of fleets that fight without seeing each other. Aircraft take off from one horizon and land on another. Strategy decouples from the line of sight. The carrier strikes first, out of range of big guns, and wins by deciding where a battle exists at all. Nat Coral Sea, fleets jab without touching. At midway, small decisions by pilots and the accidents of timing collide with code breaking to concentrate force from the air at the exact minute when decks are most vulnerable. Strategy changes in a sentence. The sea is no longer controlled by hulls alone, but by the radius of fighters and bombers a floating airfield can throw. Logistics change to match. Fuel for planes, spares for engines, training that teaches men to land on a strip that moves and shrinks under crosswind and combat fatigue. Admirals begin to think in circles on maps that are really cones of reach through time. Amphibious warfare had once meant rowboats, heroics, and attrition. Now it means engineering. The ungainly-looking LST landing ship tank arrives like a factory floor that learned to float. It carries tanks to beaches that don't want them, noses forward, opens a steel mouth, and births a campaign. The Higgins boat brings platoons directly to sand, shallow draft, and steel ramp, turning geography into a task rather than a sentence. Pontoon causeways bloom where harbors don't exist. The Mulberry artificial ports, massive, modular breakwaters and piers towed across a channel, let an army bring its city with it. Pluto, a pipeline under the ocean, pours gasoline straight from British storage to French soil. Strategy shifts because impossible places become temporarily rational. NTHE air over the beach is organized with a brutality of purpose. Radar speaks again, now mobile, now scattered in trucks behind dunes. Shore fire control parties learn to speak in the language of seconds and grids, turning a request into a shell splash half a minute later. Naval gunfire that used to be guesswork becomes guided by radios and binoculars wired to maps. The army ashore and the fleet afloat coordinate like parts of a single machine that has learned at last to share blood. And on the defensive side, anti-aircraft learns a kind of witchcraft that is not witchcraft at all. The proximity fuse, VT, arrives in the winter of fear. Before it, shells explode where math predicted a plane might be, often missing the one that actually is. After it, shells carry tiny ears that listen for the nearness of metal and fire themselves at the right distance. The first nights they're used in anger, enemy planes fly into fields of explosions that seem too efficient to be fair. Above the Ardennes, the new fuses make the sky itself unfriendly. Strategy shifts because the air no longer belongs automatically to the side that flies bravest. It belongs to the side whose shells can count. Under the ocean, an ogre and an answer wrestle. Wolf packs form, radios crackle, torpedoes bloom white trails under black water. Then, escort carriers, small, slow cousins of fleet carriers, arrive like shepherds assigned to each flock of merchantmen. Hedgehog mortars fling patterns of contact-fused bombs ahead of escort bows. Sonar grows sharper. High-frequency direction finding, Huff Duff, lets operators plot the rough position of a U-boat from the way its signal leans through the ether. Strategy changes again. The convoy is not a victim to be guarded. It is a magnet for hunters who can now be hunted. Night, once a sanctuary, becomes contested ground of its own. On land, searchlights and sound locators give way to real seeing in darkness. Airborne intercept radar, AI sets cradled in the noses of night fighters, lets a pilot ride a vector given by a controller in a dimly lit room then catch the last seconds of a bomber in the glow of a gun sight that amplifies starlight or traces of cloud-ghosted moon. The enemy's dark raids lose safety. In return, fast, low intruders cut power lines and strafe trains, writing a new style of harassment that forces defenders to redesign everything from blackout curtains to timetables. Strategy expands into the midnight hours with rules that are no longer simple. And back on the ground, artillery learns to be a storm you can aim like a hose, not a flood you pray over. Forward observers ride in small liaison planes or creep to church towers and hedgerows, with radios light enough to carry and robust enough to trust. Fire direction centers absorb calls from many units, compute solutions faster than old doctrine thought possible, and mass batteries on a target not by moving guns, but by agreeing on a clock. The effect is qualitative. A battalion requests help and receives an avalanche measured in seconds, not in someone's optimistic soon. Infantry tactics change to assume that help can arrive in time to matter, and that assumption changes how boldly people are willing to move. Medicine, too, becomes strategy, quietly, decisively. Penicillin, scaled in time, means wounds that used to be the start of a sentence called decline are now a comma called recovery. Field blood plasma and organized evacuation chains, aid station to clearing station to surgical hospital to transport, pull soldiers back from the edge quickly enough to return many to units that would otherwise have become short forever. Commanders can plan differently when the cost of an assault isn't always an irreplaceable slice of the regiment. Morale shifts as rumors spread. If you get hit, you will not be alone. If you live the first hour, you will likely live the week. That belief moves men forward. Strategy by syringe. Deception graduates from tricks to architecture. Camouflage nets and dummy tanks are still useful, but the masterwork is misdirection measured in divisions. Operation Fortitude, woven from fake radio traffic, inflatable armor, controlled leaks, and a cast of officers plausible enough to be believed, persuades an enemy that a real army sits where a real army isn't. Strategy changes because the enemy begins each day believing in a map that lies. That lie pins down reserves far from the true point of decision. Time is purchased with fabric, actors, and patience, and time is the most expensive ammunition in war. Logistics shrugs off its image as a gray clerk in the back room and strides into the war with a motor pool that stretches from horizon to horizon. The Red Ball Express, a river of trucks that behaves like an artery, carries fuel and ammunition forward along routes made sacred by signage and MPs who wave through anything wearing the right color. Supply dumps leapfrog, engineers pave, bridging units turn rivers into ideas. Strategy is now a function of gallons per mile as much as courage per yard. An army cannot outrun its gas, so tables of organization and even battlefield objectives redraw themselves around the tempo logistics can sustain. The side that marries speed and fuel wins weeks. Weeks become outcomes. Communications scale into a nervous system that can survive being cut. Field telephones hum along hedgerows. Radios skitter across frequencies. Cipher machines, safer and simpler than Enigma, flutter in tents and trucks, their operators learning to sing in brevity codes that say a paragraph with 5 syllables. On the other side, partisans and special operations units learn to live inside the seams of that web, sabotaging, reporting, redirecting attention through a single broadcast at the right hour. The front is no longer a line, it is a fabric. Strategy becomes tailoring. On the Eastern Front, the scale tilts toward immensity. There, innovation is not a gadget, but a method. Operational art as an assembly line of destruction. Soviet deep battle, planned in the 1930s, paid for in 1941, perfected by 1943, treats the enemy's front not as a wall to crack, but as a system to rupture across depth. Reconnaissance probes until it bleeds truth. Artillery opens corridors. Tank armies pour through and don't stop to count the first prizes. It is not subtle. It is not meant to be. It is the mathematics of mass converted into maneuver by a command culture that has learned, expensively, to trust its own plan. The famous silhouettes, T-34s, IL-2 Sturmovix, Katyusha rocket trucks singing their harsh lullabies, are less the point than the choreography that brings them in order at a tempo the defender cannot match. Strategy shifts because the offense now has a sustained second breath, then a third. And across the Pacific, an innovation of language becomes armor. Navajo code talkers and other indigenous language teams take a tongue that fascists never studied and apply it to battlefield communications with speed no cipher wheel could match. A forward observer says a code word for dive bomber, and a voice replies with a grid, and guns move. A company commander calls for ammunition and gets exactly what he means, not an approximation lost in static. The enemy hears sound, not sense. Strategy bends toward confidence. You can speak openly without being naked. Airborne forces, paratroopers, and glider-borne infantry transform the geometry of defense. A town behind the enemy's line is no longer safe because it is behind. It is vulnerable because it sits on a crossroads. Night drops and dawn landings seize causeways and bridges that would take days to reach by ground. Their very existence forces the enemy to reserve power for the unexpected behind him, thinning the front he thought thick. Innovation here is partly invention, aircraft, harnesses, gliders, and partly a state of mind. Accept higher chaos in exchange for strategic surprise. Sometimes it fails spectacularly. Often it succeeds just enough to tilt the day. And even the way bombs fall seeks precision. The Norden bomb sight is oversold in wartime posters and undersold by hindsight's cynics. In truth, it is a meaningful step toward aiming, not scattering. When weather allows and training aligns, bombs walk closer to rail yards and bridges than they used to. Later, Pathfinder techniques, H2S radar, oboe radio navigation, and marked target indicators teach bombers to find with instruments what clouds hide from eyes. Strategy evolves from pulverize the city to isolate the node. Still brutal, sometimes still wrong, but increasingly purposed. Jet engines shriek into the war late, their promise greater than their effect in the short window allowed. Yet, even in their brief roar, they rewrite the future playbook. Speed becomes a strategy by itself. Intercept windows shrink. Fuel demands explode. Airfields must lengthen. Tactics change to ambush ascent or strike on landing. The message is received by every planner who will fight the next war. Velocity over the target will dominate the decade to come. And then there is terror from machines that don't need pilots. The V1 and V2 arrive not as instruments of battlefield utility, but as instruments of shock and pressure, strategy as psychology. The responses they force, barrage balloons, anti-air belts reoriented, radar pickets, fighter deployments, deception raids on launch sites, bleed resources from other fronts. The rockets don't decide a campaign. They decide where a nation places some of its fear. Strategy isn't only about where to put guns. It is about where to put worry. By now, you can feel the through line. Innovation is not a trophy. It is adoption at speed. A new device matters when it becomes habit. A new method matters when it becomes doctrine. The armies and navies that learn this fastest do not merely win battles. They force the other side to fight yesterday's war tomorrow. The list of breakthroughs is long because the war is long, but a pattern emerges. See sooner, move faster, coordinate wider, heal better, deceive deeper, supply longer, and protect the nerves that let a million parts act like one. Hold on the map again, the one with coffee rings and a pencil gnawed during long briefings. The arrows across it aren't just lines of attack, they're lines of learning. Each innovation, radar on a tower, a cable under an ocean, a fuse that thinks, a cipher that breaks, extends an arrow further or draws it with fewer coffins along the way. Commanders who once counted only battalions now count beams, trucks, frequencies, pounds of plasma, habits of mind. Strategy becomes a ledger of time saved and choices created. Then this is where we pause today, at the midpoint of a story not about gadgets, but about people brave and stubborn enough to fit those gadgets into the way they fight. Ahead lies the closing chapter of the war and the longer shadow it casts, how these innovations, born of necessity and paid for dearly, echo into the peace that follows. shaping doctrines, alliances, and the quiet confidence of nations that learned to survive by thinking differently. N. Pick up the map again. Coffee rings have dried into pale halos. Pencil grooves have turned into little canyons you can feel with a fingertip. The war is older now, 1943–1944, and the innovations that began as experiments have hardened into habits. What once felt like bold exception now looks like procedure. And when procedure changes, strategy changes. When strategy changes, outcomes follow. Begin with something as humble as a bridge. Before, a destroyed span meant a long detour and a longer wait. Now, engineer battalions arrive with flatbed miracles. Bailey bridges, prefabricated, modular, pushed out over water on rollers like steel lace. They assemble under fire, panels locking with the rhythm of practiced crews. In minutes or hours, not days, a river that wanted to be a front becomes a memory. Tanks roll across a thing that did not exist that morning. Strategy shifts because geography can be rewritten on demand. Watch the rivers themselves. Amphibious tractors, Amtraks, look ungainly on land, but in surf they are kings. They crawl through breakers, ignore coral heads that break landing craft, and carry riflemen to dry sand with breath left in their lungs. On Pacific atolls, and later in broader landings, these ugly heroes change the calculus. You no longer need perfect beaches. You need crews who know how to steer into chaos with a machine that forgives the sea's bad manners. And above, see the sky thick with cargo. A new kind of air war hums, nothing to do with dogfights, everything to do with hunger. C-47s haul fuel, ammunition, food. Mail. Troop carriers throw parachutes at night and supplies by day. Flying columns become possible because an invisible bridge connects depots to forward edges. The enemy tries to cut that bridge with flak and fighters. Escorts and altitude argue back. Strategy keeps a second set of books now. One ledger for combat power, another for the lift that keeps it moving. End turn to a desert and a thin line of rail. The British build a pipeline across sand, truck heads like migrating towns, depots that leapfrog forward as surely as brigades. On the other side, an army famous for operational art discovers that genius cannot conjure gasoline. Tanks become bunkers when the fuel runs out. The lesson is brutal and permanent. Logistics outvotes maneuver if maneuver ignores logistics. Innovation is not always about a new toy. Often it's the will to make old transportation behave like a new one, predictable, sufficient, relentless. Look now at how armies hide and how they learn to see through hiding. Camouflage matures from netting to artistry. Painters teach units how to bend straight edges into background, how to break the grammar of a silhouette so a photograph cannot parse it. Dummy fields sprout, wooden fighters, inflated tanks, fake tire tracks seated by men with rope and imagination. To answer, reconnaissance shifts from eyes to patterns. Aerial photos stitched into mosaics. Analysts who memorize the way a real depot ages differently than a fake one. Interpreters who can tell whether a forest shadow belongs to a tree or to something that breathes gasoline. Strategy learns subtlety. You must not only move, you must decide what to show. And in the factories, innovation adopts a second soul, scale. The Americans perfect interchangeable parts at a magnitude no one imagined. AB-24 rolls off a line where car builders taught airplane builders the religion of throughput. The Soviets move entire plants east, beyond reach of bombers, rebuild under tarps, and stamp out T-34s with armor angles that shrug off hits and tracks wide enough to eat mud. Germany innovates brilliantly but too often individually, machines superbly engineered and painfully rare. Strategy favors the side that can afford ordinary excellence in extraordinary numbers. Inside small tents and big headquarters, a different innovation matures. The map itself learns to predict. Operations researchers, mathematicians, and oddballs in uniform run numbers that feel impolite. How many trucks must leave per hour to keep a core fed? How many escorts reduce losses to an acceptable slope? Which patrol routes intersect the highest probability of a U-boat given known radio nets? This is not romantic. It is war made legible to graphs. And graphs, argued well, prevent waste measured in lives. And on the medical side, evacuation chains get faster, cleaner, more certain. Field surgeons adopt triage with a rigor learned by hard experience. Save first those who can return. Stabilize those who need time. Comfort those you cannot save enough to lie to. Air evacuation grows from rare to routine. Litter racks in cargo aircraft. Nurses who learn turbulence and courage at the same time. Infection rates fall. Survival rates climb. Commanders plan differently because wounded soldiers will be men again, not names on a wall waiting to be carved. And in the cities, those tragic laboratories, another set of innovations tries to separate military aim from civilian catastrophe and fails too often, but not always. Pathfinder forces mark targets with flares when clouds permit. Mosquitoes, fast, wooden British aircraft, led heavy bombers to aim points that instruments can't find alone. American daylight bombing pairs Norden sights with formation discipline and escort fighters that finally have the range to stay to Berlin and back. P-51s and long-range tanks tether the bombers with protection instead of prayers. The German fighter force bleeds out over home fields because innovation married to production finally outlasts perfection married to scarcity. Strategy bends, painfully, toward a sky where one side increasingly owns the hours after noon. Inside resistance movements, radios become lifelines. A coded phrase in a BBC broadcast pushes a network into motion. Rails blown on a night chosen for maximum confusion. Guard posts cut off from each other. Telephone poles felled where roads funnel. The innovation isn't just the set that glows in a farmhouse attic. It's the discipline that keeps transmissions short and schedules unpredictable, and the cryptographic habits that let strangers trust. Armies on the map move faster when rail yards and the margins are ash. Strategy includes villagers now, men and women without uniforms who turn keys in locks that generals can't even see. Shift to the final arc of the war and watch coordination itself become an innovation. In the winter of 1944-45, Allied air and ground operations synchronize in hours, not days. Artillery plans change on the fly because forward observers and infantry company commanders can talk directly, clearly, with enough shared training to make language precise. Tank and infantry tactics stop quarreling and kneel into partnership. Tanks suppress, infantry protects, engineers follow like locksmiths, for everything steel cannot solve. A battalion no longer fights alone. It fights as the visible tip of a machine that has learned to keep its promises. And then, there is the last, terrible innovation. 2 bursts of sun at ground level that end the most destructive war and begin an argument that will outlive everyone who designed them. Even here, in the darkest chapter of ingenuity, you can trace the same sinews. Laboratories, accelerated by new management. Logistics of uranium and graphite. Codenamed Mountains of Secrecy. Calculations checked by colleagues whose names nobody outside remembers. The weapons worked because thousands of smaller innovations worked first. Strategy, for a few days in August, becomes a question of whether anyone will ever fight a world war again now that a city can be turned into heat by a single aircraft. The answer is not simple. The consequence is permanent. NSO. What did these innovations do to strategy, finally? They changed the unit of time in which decisions mattered. Before, a general could think in days. After, he had to think in minutes. Radar shrank warning windows. Radio multiplied the reach of orders. Engines and airfields let force concentrate far faster than rail ever could. Intelligence punctured secrecy. Deception punctured certainty. Logistics stopped being a background chore and became the governor on any plan worth reading. Medicine returned men to battle, altering the arithmetic of risk. Engineering turned coastlines into doors and rivers into corridors. And the habit of jointness, land, sea, air, learning to share oxygen, meant that no arm could pretend to win alone. There is another, quieter answer. Innovations changed who got to decide. Power moved downward. A sergeant with a radio and a map could call steel from the sky. A nurse with a syringe and training could decide that a man saw his children again. A young woman at a plotting table could place a token that turned a squadron left instead of right and kept a town from gaining a second cemetery. Strategy ceased to be only what was written in a briefing folder. It became the sum of 1,000 small competences made possible by new tools and taught until they became reflex. NTHE war ends, but the ideas refuse to. Radar becomes air traffic control. Carriers become diplomacy with decks. Pipelines, prefabs, and planning software become the invisible armature of peacetime economies. Code-breaking evolves into computing, then into a world where messages cross oceans in under a second, and the value of a secret is measured not in months, but in milliseconds. Night vision migrates to police cars, penicillin to pharmacies, operations research to airlines and hospitals, Bailey bridges to disaster relief, airborne to firefighting, logistics algorithms to your doorstep the day after you click buy, NTHE veterans age. The factory's quiet, the maps go into drawers, but the lineage remains. Every time a pilot trusts an instrument more than a hunch, every time a convoy takes the shorter safe road because someone ran the numbers, every time a medic stabilizes a wound on a street and a paramedic helicopter turns minutes into survival, you are watching the grandchildren of those innovations do peacetime work. It is tempting to think that innovations win wars. More precisely, the right innovations, adopted fast and taught well, make victory possible at a lower price and a higher speed. The wrong innovations, worshipped without discipline or field sense, waste lives and money with equal cruelty. The difference is not the machine. It is the marriage between purpose and practice. Leaders who know what the thing is for, sergeants who know how to use it, technicians who keep it breathing in mud and rain, clerks who make sure a box of fuses is where it needs to be at dawn. NSO end where we began. A table, a map, cold mugs, and a pencil. Draw two versions of the same campaign. One fought with the tools and habits of 1918, the other with the networked reflexes of 1944. In one, divisions grind and bleed in straight lines and telegrams. In the other, arrows bend faster, supply lines flow thicker, radios argue more effectively than runners, and medical tents glow brighter with the chemistry of a future that arrived in time. The difference is not a handful of miracles, it is a culture of problem-solving that refused to stop at impossible. NTHE last line on the map is not an arrow. It is a circle around a thought. Innovation matters most when it gives you back time. Time to choose, time to correct, time to save. Radar gave time to scramble. Code breaking gave time to reroute. Engineering gave time to cross. Logistics gave time to keep moving. Medicine gave time to come home. Deception gave time to be elsewhere when the enemy arrived. Each minute collected by those advances added up to days, and the side that banked days bought victory. And after the victory, the same circle still holds. Nations that learned to survive by thinking differently kept thinking differently. They built systems designed to warn early, respond jointly, heal quickly, supply reliably, and decide closer to the truth. They taught those habits to their children in uniforms, and some to their children out of them. The best memorial to innovation is not a museum case. It's a routine that works quietly on an ordinary Tuesday. Close the map, stack the mugs, snap the pencil back into the tin. Walk out into air that does not smell like cordite. The war is over in this story, but the lesson walks beside you. When the world asks for impossible, answer with better questions, faster learning, and tools honest enough to do what you promise they can do. That is how armies won then. It is how free people keep their footing now. And if you need one sentence to carry with you, carry this. In the worst years on Earth, human beings shortened the distance between truth and action. That is the innovation that outlasts them all.